The first thing folks noticed that winter was the smoke, or rather the lack of it. In a valley where every chimney spoke against the cold, her cabin stood quiet. Snow lay thick over the roof and wrapped itself around the porch rails, and still no thin ribbon of gray rose into the pale sky. In January, that kind of silence from a chimney was not just strange. It was dangerous. The cabin sat at the edge of the clearing, backed by dark woods that climbed the hills like a wall. It was an old log place, built by hand long before the road was cut through the valley. The logs were thick and weathered, their lines worn smooth by wind and rain. In summer it looked peaceful. In winter it looked small against the white fields and bare trees. The kind of place that depended on firewood the way a body depends on breath. She had lived there alone for 3 winters. Folks in town did not know her well. She kept to herself, coming down to the general store once every few weeks for flour, lamp oil, and coffee. She paid in cash and spoke little. There was nothing unfriendly about her. She simply carried herself like someone used to making her own way. Her dresses were plain and practical, her boots thick and worn, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. When she first arrived in the valley, people whispered that no one could manage that far out without help. Winters were hard here. Snow could stack up to the windowsills. The creek froze solid. The wind blew down from the hills and cut through wool and bone alike. A good woodpile was as important as a strong roof. Everyone knew that. Every fall, men split and stacked cords of firewood high against their sheds. You could judge a household by the neatness of its logs. That winter, though, her yard showed no such stack. By mid-December, the valley had settled into deep cold. Frost clung to the inside of windows. The sound of an axe striking wood carried across the fields in the mornings, but no one heard that sound from her clearing. When a pair of neighbors passed by on their way back from checking traps, they slowed their horses and looked toward the cabin. Snow covered the yard smooth and untouched, no fresh-cut wood. No trail from the porch to a woodpile. "She will not last the month," one of them muttered, pulling his coat tighter. They might have let it be, but the days grew sharper. The sky turned hard and white. One morning, the wind howled so fierce it drove snow in waves across the open ground. The kind of storm that makes a man thankful for his stove and a woman grateful for a full woodshed. That was when the worry began to sit heavy in their chests. By the 3rd week of January, someone pointed out that there had still been no smoke. In a small community, silence speaks loud. A cabin with no fire in winter means trouble. It means illness or empty cupboards or worse. The older folks remembered seasons when families froze because they misjudged their wood. Back then, pride kept many from asking for help. Pride could be colder than any wind. 2 men decided to ride out to her place one afternoon. They told themselves it was only neighborly. They would check on her, maybe offer to bring a few armloads of logs. The snow was deep, and the horses moved slow through the drifts. The forest stood bare and still. When they reached the clearing, the cabin looked just as it had before, quiet, snow resting heavy on the roof, the chimney clean and pale against the sky. They dismounted and walked up the narrow path to the porch. Their boots crunched loud in the silence. One of them knocked on the door with the side of his fist. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. She stood there wrapped in her shawl, her cheeks pink from warmth, not from cold. The men noticed that first, warmth, her eyes were steady. There was no sign of sickness in her face. No tremble in her hands. "We came to see if you needed wood," one said, clearing his throat. "It is a hard winter." She glanced past them at the open yard as if surprised by the question. "I thank you kindly," she replied. "But I have enough." The men exchanged a look. "Enough from where?" They did not see a woodpile. They did not see chopped logs stacked by the wall. The snow in her yard lay smooth except for the path to the door. There were no fresh cuts in the nearby trees, no axe leaning against the porch. One of them shifted his weight. "We have not seen smoke from your chimney." At that she smiled, small and knowing. "The stove draws well," she said, "and I do not waste wood." It was not an answer, not the kind they expected. Still, the air drifting out from the open door carried the faint scent of burning oak. It was warm inside. They could feel it against their frozen cheeks. They left uneasy. Word spread fast. She claimed to have firewood, yet none could see it. No one heard chopping. No one saw her hauling logs. Some wondered if she was buying it and bringing it in at night. Others thought she must be burning scraps, broken furniture perhaps, anything she could find. A few feared she might be living in the cold and simply hiding it out of pride. Then came the morning that changed everything. A heavy snowfall had come down in the night, thick and wet. Branches bent low, fences disappeared under white mounds. When the men rode past her clearing again, they noticed something new. A portion of the yard near the side of the cabin looked uneven. The snow had sunk in a long rectangle, as if the ground beneath had shifted. Curiosity is a strong pull in a quiet valley. They rode closer and dismounted. The snow in that spot seemed thinner, disturbed. One of them brushed it away with his boot and struck wood beneath. Not loose boards, not debris. A solid, fitted plank set into the earth. A door, flat and wide, almost hidden beneath the snow. They looked at one another, then back at the cabin. The chimney still without visible smoke. Carefully they cleared more snow. Hinges showed along one side. A handle lay flush with the surface, cleverly shaped so it would not catch the eye. The men crouched and grasped it. The door was heavy, but it lifted with steady pressure. Cold air did not rush up from below. Instead, there rose a dry, woody scent, rich and clean. They leaned over the opening. Below them was a narrow set of steps leading down into the earth. The walls were lined with stone. At the bottom, stacked with careful hands, lay rows upon rows of split logs. Oak and maple, cut to equal length, piled higher than a man's waist. The wood was dry as bone, sheltered from snow and rain, protected from rot, enough to last not just one winter, but two. For a moment neither man spoke. An underground shed. A cellar for firewood, hidden beneath the snow where no one would think to look. One of them let out a low whistle. "Well, I will be." They stood there in the quiet, staring at the proof of her planning. She had not been careless. She had not been foolish. While others stacked wood in the open and covered it with tarps, she had built a shelter beneath the ground, where frost could not reach and wind could not steal the heat from her logs. Behind them, the cabin door creaked open. They turned. She stood at the edge of the porch, watching them. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "You found it?" she said. The men straightened, suddenly feeling like boys caught where they did not belong. Snow drifted lightly around them. The valley lay silent, holding its breath. "We meant no harm," one began. "We thought you might be in need." She walked toward them slowly, her boots steady in the snow. "I know what folks thought," she replied. "But I have lived through colder winters than this one." There was something in her tone that made them pause. Not pride exactly, not anger either, something deeper. A history they did not know. They looked back down into the underground shed, at the careful rows of dry logs, at the work it must have taken to dig and line and build it alone. This was not a last-minute effort. This was preparation laid months, maybe years in advance. "You built this yourself?" one asked quietly. She did not answer right away. The wind shifted, brushing snow from the trees in soft showers. Somewhere in the woods, a branch cracked under the weight of ice. "I built what I needed," she said at last. The words hung in the cold air. The men felt their earlier judgment settle heavy in their stomachs. They had assumed weakness where there was strength. They had seen a lone woman in an old cabin and believed they understood her story. But now, standing over that hidden cellar of firewood, they realized they had only seen the surface. And as she stepped closer to the open hatch, looking down at the stacked logs below, her face changed, just slightly. Not pride. Not relief, something else. Something that made one of the men wonder if the underground shed was built only to keep wood dry all winter, or to keep something else hidden beneath the snow. The wind pushed at her skirt as she stepped up beside the open hatch. The men moved back to give her room. She looked down at the stacked logs the way a farmer looks over a field of corn before harvest, careful, measuring, quietly proud, though she would never say it plain. "It keeps the wood dry," she said. "Snow can bury a pile in a night. Damp wood steals more heat than it gives. Underground, it stays steady." One of the men nodded slowly. Never seen the like of it. My father built root cellars this way, she replied. Stone-lined. Deep enough that frost cannot touch what is stored. Potatoes 1 year, apples another. I only changed what went inside. She lowered the hatch with both hands. The door fit tight against the earth. Once covered in snow again, it would vanish into the yard like a secret folded back into the ground. They stood there a moment longer, unsure what to say. The air between them had shifted. What had begun as concern now felt like something else, something closer to apology. Yet no one spoke it aloud. You should have told us, one finally offered. Would have saved talk in town. She brushed snow from her gloves. Talk will come whether I feed it or not. There was no bitterness in her voice, only fact. The men tipped their hats and made their way back to their horses. As they rode off, they glanced over their shoulders once more. She was still standing by the buried hatch, watching them leave. That evening, the story reached the general store before the men did. By the time they stepped through the door, boots stomping snow from the threshold, every ear in the place was turned toward them. Is she freezing out there? Someone asked from near the stove. The taller man removed his gloves slowly. Freezing? He said, She has more dry wood than any of us. They told of the underground shed, the stone walls, the neat rows of oak and maple. A low murmur filled the store. Surprise, yes, but also something like unease. Folks were used to seeing how their neighbors lived, woodpiles stacked in plain sight, smoke rising honest and clear. A hidden cellar of firewood felt different, private. She must have planned it for months, the storekeeper said, rubbing his chin. That kind of digging is no small task, the men nodded. They had noticed the careful cuts in the stone, the way the steps were laid. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. It was not rough work, it was deliberate. She said her father built root cellars, one added. Her father? The storekeeper repeated, as if tasting the words. No one in town knew much about her family. She had arrived alone in early spring 3 years back with a wagon, a mule, and a handful of tools. Paid cash for the cabin and the small plot around it, asked no favors. Where is she from, truly? A woman by the counter asked. Anyone know? No one answered. That night, wind rattled shutters across the valley. In her cabin, the stove burned low and steady. The iron belly glowed faintly in the dark. She sat at the table near the window, mending a tear in her wool skirt. The lamplight flickered against the log walls. The room was plain but orderly. A braided rug on the floor, shelves lined with jars of preserved beans and corn, a small stack of books beside the bed. She paused in her stitching and listened. The winter woods have a sound of their own. Snow shifting from branches, the distant cry of a fox, the groan of trees bending in the wind. She knew each sound well. She had learned them over many seasons, long before this valley. Her gaze drifted to the floorboards near the hearth. Beneath the cabin, below the kitchen table, the earth ran cool and deep. The underground shed lay not far from where she sat, close enough to reach quickly if needed. She set down her needle. There had been a time when she did not trust open wood piles. Not after one winter when rain turned to ice and soaked through every tarp. Not after she woke one morning to find half her stack gone, footprints leading into the forest. Hard times make desperate men. Firewood can mean life or death. She had learned that lesson young. Her father had taught her more than how to stack logs. He taught her to think ahead, to prepare for storms before the sky darkens, to build in such a way that what you depend on cannot be easily taken. When she was a girl, they lived in a cabin even smaller than this one. Snow came early that year and stayed long past March. Neighbors were miles away. Her father dug a cellar by hand with a shovel and stubborn will. Stone by stone he lined it. Stored what they needed beneath the ground where cold stayed even and thieves rarely looked. She remembered the sound of his shovel striking frozen earth, the scrape of stone against stone. The way he would pause, wipe his brow, and say, "We build so winter does not catch us sleeping." Those words had followed her across states and seasons. In this valley she had watched the way people did things. Stacked wood high against sheds, covered it with canvas. Good enough in most winters, but wind could tear canvas. Snow could drift deep, and eyes could see what lay in plain view. She had started digging the underground shed her first summer there. At dawn and again at dusk, when the heat was softer, She worked alone, hauling earth in a wheelbarrow, stacking stones she gathered from the creek bed. No one paid much mind. Folks assumed she was tending a garden. By autumn, the cellar was finished. She split wood herself, steady and patient, stacking it below ground in neat rows, enough to last through January and February without worry. But there was another reason she chose to hide her firewood. A week after the men discovered the hatch, a stranger came through town. He arrived just before sunset, leading a tired horse and asking for directions to the upper ridge. His coat was worn but sturdy. His eyes moved often, scanning faces, measuring the place. The storekeeper offered him coffee. In small towns, strangers draw attention the way smoke draws the eye. "You headed far?" someone asked. "Far enough," the man replied. His voice carried a rough edge. "Heard there was land for sale up this way." The room grew quiet. Most land in the valley had been claimed for years. He drank his coffee slow. Asked a few questions about cabins near the tree line, cabins set apart from the main road. "She keeps to herself," one of the men who had seen the underground shed said before he could stop himself. "Lives near the clearing past the bend." The stranger's gaze sharpened. "Alone?" A pause settled over the room. "So far as we know," the storekeeper answered carefully. The stranger finished his cup and thanked them. When he stepped back into the cold, several pairs of eyes followed him through the window. Word traveled faster than a thaw. By morning it had reached her cabin. A young boy from town, sent to deliver a sack of flour she had ordered, mentioned the stranger in passing. "Man asking about cabins," he said, brushing snow from his hat. "Said he might head toward yours." She thanked him and gave him a slice of cornbread for the road. After he left, she closed the door and stood still in the quiet. The stove crackled softly. She walked to the window and looked out over the clearing. The snow lay unbroken except for the boy's tracks. The forest beyond stood tall and watchful. Strangers did not come often. And when they did, they rarely asked so many questions. She moved to the hearth and crouched, pressing her palm lightly against the floorboards as if feeling for something beneath. The underground shed was secure. The hatch fit tight. Snow concealed its edges. But her mind had already begun to measure other things. The distance from cabin to tree line. The weight of the iron poker by the stove. The way the wind carried sound across the clearing. That afternoon, she took down a small wooden box from the top shelf. Inside were papers, folded and worn. A deed bearing her father's name, a letter never sent. And beneath them, a simple map drawn in careful lines. It showed more than just her plot of land. It showed tunnels. Not large ones, not sprawling. Just a narrow passage running from beneath the cabin toward the old well at the edge of the woods, a precaution her father once spoke of but never built. She traced the lines with her finger. The underground shed was only part of what lay beneath the snow. As dusk settled, she stepped outside with a lantern. The sky burned pale orange behind the hills. Cold crept in fast. She walked slowly around the cabin, studying the drifts. No new tracks, yet the feeling remained. That the valley was shifting in ways she could not yet see. Back in town, the stranger had not left at sunrise as expected. He lingered near the road leading toward her clearing, asking again about the woman who lived alone, asking about how she kept warm in winter. "She has her ways," the storekeeper said tightly. "That is all you need to know," the stranger smiled without warmth. By nightfall, clouds rolled in heavy and low. Another storm threatened. Wind swept across the fields, erasing footprints and smoothing snow into fresh blankets. In her cabin, she added one more log to the stove and listened to the wind rise. The fire burned steady, fed by wood no one could see from the road. She moved to the table and unfolded the map once more. If winter had taught her anything, it was this. What lies beneath often matters more than what is seen above. Outside, somewhere beyond the tree line, a branch snapped. Not from wind. She lifted her head. The underground shed kept her logs dry all winter. It kept her warm when others doubted she could manage. But as the storm began to howl against the cabin walls, she understood that the cellar might soon be called upon to protect more than just firewood. And as the first hard knock struck her door through the rising wind, she did not reach for her shawl. She reached for the floor. The knock came again, harder this time, rattling the wooden door against its frame. The wind howled through the clearing, carrying snow in sharp bursts that scraped against the cabin walls. She stayed still for one long breath, her hand pressed flat to the floorboards near the hearth. Beneath her palm, the earth felt steady and cold, the hidden space below silent and waiting. A third knock followed, slower, deliberate. She rose without hurry and crossed the room. The iron poker rested where it always did, leaning beside the stove. She did not pick it up, not yet. Instead, she lifted the latch and opened the door just enough to see the man standing there. Snow clung to his shoulders and hat. His horse stood tied to the fence post, head low against the wind. Up close, his face looked older than it had in the store, lines set deep around his mouth. His eyes were sharp, restless. "Evening," he said, voice raised over the storm. "Hope I am not troubling you." She held the door firm against the gust, pushing inward. "Storm is coming harder." "You should be on your way," he gave a thin smile. "That is just it. I was headed up the ridge, but the snow caught me. Thought I might warm myself a spell. Folks in town said you keep a fine fire." Her gaze did not shift from his face. "Folks in town talk too much. Maybe so." His eyes flicked past her shoulder, toward the glow of the stove. "Still, a man can freeze quick in weather like this." The wind surged again, blowing snow between them. For a moment she saw her father in her mind, standing in a doorway years ago, weighing the same choice. Turn away a stranger and risk a life on your conscience. Let him in and risk something else. She stepped aside. He entered slowly, removing his hat, stamping snow from his boots. Warm air wrapped around him. He glanced at the stove first, then at the shelves of jars, the table, the narrow bed. His gaze lingered on details most men would overlook. The thickness of the logs in the wall. The sturdy hinges on the trapdoor that led to the small crawlspace near the back. "You keep this place well," he said. "I keep what is mine." She closed the door and set the latch. The storm outside swallowed the clearing whole, wind whistling under the eaves. Inside, the cabin felt smaller with him in it. He moved closer to the stove, holding his hands out to the heat. "Not much smoke from your chimney," he remarked lightly. "Hard to tell from the road if anyone is home. The stove draws clean. So I hear." Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of burning oak. She studied him in the flicker of lamplight. His coat was travel-worn but not poor. His boots were sturdy. A leather satchel hung across his chest, damp with melted snow. "You are not headed to the ridge," she said plainly. His mouth curved. "No? There is nothing for sale up there." He did not answer right away. Instead, he paced once across the narrow room, slow and measuring. "You have been here some time," he said at last. "3 winters, if I recall." She did not ask how he knew that. "I keep to myself," she replied. "That you do?" His gaze drifted to the floor near the hearth, then back to her face. "Must be hard, managing alone." "I manage." In town, the storm had driven most folks indoors. Lamps glowed behind frosted windows. The general store shut early, but talk continued around kitchen tables. The stranger had been seen riding toward her clearing just before dusk. The 2 men who discovered the underground shed exchanged uneasy looks when they heard. "He has no business out there in this weather," one said. "Neither do we," the other replied, though he was already pulling on his coat. Back in the cabin, the stranger drew a chair closer to the stove without asking. He sat and leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Truth is," he began, "I am looking for something." "Land?" she asked. "Not land." The words hung between them. She kept her voice steady. "You will not find much here. You would be surprised what lies hidden in these hills." His eyes held hers now, no pretense left. Old deeds, old claims. Property that was never properly recorded. She felt the air shift, not fear, not yet, but recognition. "My father's name was on the deed," she said quietly. "It passed to me lawful. I have seen papers that say otherwise." The wind battered the cabin harder, as if testing its strength. She took one step closer to the stove, placing herself between him and the center of the room. "Papers can be forged," she replied. "So can stories." They regarded one another in the firelight. Beneath her calm, thoughts moved quick and sharp. She had known this day might come. Land that borders timber and water draws attention. A lone cabin at the edge of a clearing looks easy to challenge. You asked about how I keep warm, she said. That is your interest? In a manner of speaking. His gaze drifted again, subtle but not subtle enough, to the floorboards, to the slight difference in grain where the trapdoor to the small storage space sat near the wall. Not the underground shed outside, something else. She understood then that he was not only after land, he was searching for proof. Of what she did not yet know? A knock sounded again at the door, this time faint under the roar of wind. Both of them turned. Her heart thudded once, hard. The stranger rose slowly. Expecting company? She did not answer. Instead, she crossed the room and opened the door. Two figures stood outside, shoulders hunched against the storm, the men from town. "We thought you might need help," one called over the wind, eyes flicking past her to the stranger inside. For a brief moment, relief warmed her chest. Not because she feared the man by her stove, but because witnesses changed the shape of things. "You came far in this," she said. "We did." She stepped back to let them enter. Snow blew in around their boots before she shut the door again. The cabin now held 4 people, the air thick with damp wool and unspoken questions. The stranger inclined his head politely. "Evening." The taller neighbor did not return the gesture. "Road is near buried," he said to her. "We passed this man's horse tied in your yard." "He sought warmth," she replied evenly. "And found it," the stranger added. The stove popped loudly, sending a spark against the iron grate. The sound made them all glance down. The second neighbor, quieter than the first, let his eyes roam the room the way the stranger's had. He had been there before, after all. He had seen the underground shed in the yard. He knew she was capable of building more than met the eye. "You said you were looking for land," he said to the stranger. "Which land exactly? Unclaimed land?" the man replied smoothly. "There are parcels in these parts tied up in disputes older than any of us. This one is not," she said. He turned to her with a patient look. "That depends on which ledger you read." The wind howled so loud then that it seemed to press the cabin inward. Snow thudded against the roof. For a moment no one spoke, the storm filling the silence. In the pause, her mind moved back years. To a different cabin, a different winter. Men arriving with papers claiming rights her father had never heard of. The arguments that followed. The threats spoken soft but meant to carry weight. Her father had not trusted visible stores. "Not wood? Not records?" "You have come far to chase old ink," she said now. "I have come far for what is owed," the stranger replied. The taller neighbor shifted his stance. "Owed by whom?" The man's gaze flicked to the floor again. "By those who think hiding things underground makes them disappear." The words were measured, but they struck clear. She felt heat rise in her chest, not from the stove. "You speak in riddles. I speak in facts. There was a shipment years back. Timber cut from land that was not properly claimed. Payment never settled." The neighbors exchanged confused glances. "Timber? Shipment?" "My father cut only what the deed allowed," she said, voice steady but low. "Your father is not here to confirm that?" The room seemed to shrink. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing the clearing off from the world. No easy path down to town now, no simple exit for any of them. The quieter neighbor stepped closer to her side, not touching but near enough to show where he stood. "You are accusing without proof." The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly. "Proof has a way of surfacing, especially when something has been built to hide it." Her thoughts raced to the underground shed, to the stone-lined walls filled with dry logs, and beyond that to the map folded in the wooden box. The narrow passage drawn in careful lines. He did not know everything, not yet, but he knew enough to dig. The cabin filled with the smell of burning oak, steady and warm. Beneath the floor, the earth held its secrets tight. The taller neighbor spoke again, voice firm. "Storm will keep us here till morning at least." "Best we all mind our words." The stranger gave a small nod. "Of course." Yet his gaze did not leave her. She met it without flinching. The underground shed had kept her firewood dry all winter. It had proven her capable in the eyes of the valley, but now another kind of winter had arrived. One made not of snow, but of claims and old debts and men who followed paper trails through frozen ground. The storm showed no sign of easing. And inside that small cabin, surrounded by heat and suspicion, she understood that whatever lay buried beneath her land would not stay undisturbed much longer. The storm did not let up. Wind pressed against the cabin walls in steady waves as if testing each log for weakness. Snow packed tight against the door and drifted high along the windows. Inside, the stove burned on, steady and controlled, fed by wood no one outside could count or measure. 4 people shared the small room, and yet the air felt thin. The taller neighbor removed his coat and hung it near the door, his movements slow and careful. The quieter one stayed near the table, eyes moving between her and the stranger. No one sat fully at ease. The stranger remained closest to the stove as though the heat belonged to him by right of arrival. "You said there was a shipment," the quieter neighbor spoke at last. "Timber cut without claim. When was this supposed to have happened?" "Years ago," the stranger replied. "Before she came here? Before this cabin was sold? My father cut timber for trade," she said. "He paid his taxes. He kept receipts." "Receipts can vanish," the stranger said calmly, her jaw tightened. "Not if you know where to keep them." He held her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. "Exactly," the neighbors both caught that tone. The conversation was no longer about land alone. It was about something hidden, something preserved, like firewood in an underground shed. Outside, a loud crack split through the wind. A branch had snapped under the weight of snow. All 4 of them turned instinctively toward the sound. The storm was building toward its peak. "You rode out here in bad weather?" the taller neighbor said to the stranger. "Risked your horse, risked yourself. That tells me you are certain of something." "I am certain enough," the stranger replied. "And what do you expect to find tonight?" she asked. His answer came smooth. "Assurance," the word settled heavy. The quieter neighbor stepped closer to the stove, warming his hands. "Assurance of what?" "That what was taken will be returned. That old debts are settled." Her heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. She had learned long ago that fear clouds thought. Calm keeps it sharp. "You have no proof that anything was taken," she said. "Only talk and suspicion," he shrugged lightly. "Sometimes suspicion is enough to begin digging." The neighbors exchanged a look. Digging. The word echoed louder than it should have. Her gaze flicked once, only once, toward the floor near the hearth before she caught herself. But the stranger saw it, a faint shift of eyes, a small tightening in her shoulders. His smile did not widen, but it deepened. The storm outside roared like a living thing. Snow hissed against the windows. The cabin creaked but held strong. The taller neighbor cleared his throat. "No one will be digging in this weather." "Of course not," the stranger said easily. "Not tonight. Not tonight." The promise of another day lingered in those words. She moved to the table and poured water into 4 tin cups. Her hands were steady. "You speak of old debts. My father passed before I ever set foot in this valley. If you have claim, bring it through the proper court, and wait months while records are examined," he replied. "While evidence is misplaced?" "You assume guilt," she said quietly. "I assume opportunity." The neighbors stiffened at that. In town, long before she arrived, there had been disputes over logging rights, boundaries unclear, marks on trees carved and recarved, timber sold downriver with little oversight. It was not unheard of for a shipment to be claimed twice, but most of that had settled years back. "You are not from here," the taller neighbor said flatly. "No," the stranger admitted. "But I represent interests that extend beyond this valley." "Interests," she repeated. He leaned back in the chair, stretching his boots toward the stove. "There are men who lost money on that shipment. Men who believe the timber was cut from land that did not belong to your father. And you have come to collect from his daughter," she said. "I have come to see what remains." Silence fell thick and hard. The stove popped again. A single ember shifted. The quieter neighbor's voice dropped lower. "You think she has hidden something underground?" The stranger did not answer directly. "A person who builds an underground shed for firewood understands concealment." The words were meant to provoke, to draw reaction. Instead, she surprised them all by nodding once. "Yes, I understand concealment." The admission hung in the room like frost. "And I understand preparation," she continued. "Winter is harsh. So are men who come with accusations. The taller neighbor stepped slightly forward, his presence firm. "You will not accuse without proof in this house." The stranger lifted his hands in a show of calm. "I accuse no one. I ask questions." "Then ask them plain," she said, his eyes sharpened. "Does anything lie beneath this cabin besides earth and stone?" The question cut straight. The wind howled as if in answer. Her mind raced through years of memory. Her father teaching her how to wrap papers in oilcloth, how to seal them inside a tin box, how to lower them into a space beneath the ground where damp would not reach, how to build more than one hiding place. "Yes," she said finally. All three men shifted at once. "There is more beneath this cabin than earth," she continued. "There is history, there are tools. There are things left by the man who built this life." The stranger's gaze burned steady. "Records? Memories," she replied. The quieter neighbor let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "You are playing with words?" the stranger said. "No," she answered. "I am choosing them carefully." Outside, the storm reached its height. Wind slammed against the door so hard that the latch rattled. Snow fell in thick sheets, cutting the clearing off entirely. No one was leaving until dawn, if dawn came clear at all. The taller neighbor moved to brace the door with a heavy chair. "We sit this out," he said. "All of us." The stranger nodded slowly. "Very well." Hours stretched long in that cabin. They took turns adding logs to the stove. The warmth remained steady, almost defiant against the chaos outside. The underground shed, packed with dry oak and maple, ensured that the fire would not falter. At one point, the quieter neighbor spoke softly to her while the stranger stared into the flames. "If there is something buried that could harm you, you should say so." She met his eyes. "There is nothing buried that was not earned." He studied her face, searching for doubt. He found none. Near midnight, the storm began to ease, though wind still rattled the shutters. The stranger rose and paced again, his boots thudding lightly on the wooden floor. "You admit there are things hidden," he said. "You admit your father dealt in timber. You admit there were shipments." "I admit he worked hard," she said. "I admit he prepared for hardship. And if proof surfaces that he took what was not his," her voice did not waver. "Then I will face it." The neighbors watched this exchange closely. In her calm they saw strength. In his persistence they saw intent. The stranger stopped pacing. "Then perhaps we should bring what lies beneath into the open." The air seemed to freeze. "You will not tear up her floor," the taller neighbor said sharply. "I would not damage property," the stranger replied. "But if she consents, we could settle this before the storm fully passes." Settle, another loaded word. Her thoughts flickered to the wooden box on the shelf, to the folded map, to the narrow passage drawn in ink. If he began digging in the wrong place, he might find more than he expected. "You will have your answer," she said slowly. "But not like this." "Why not?" he pressed. "Because digging in frozen ground at night proves nothing," she replied. "If you seek truth, you will wait for daylight." He held her gaze for a long moment. The storm quieted further, leaving behind a heavy stillness. Snow clung thick against the windows, turning them pale. The quieter neighbor spoke up. "We all go to town in the morning. We bring the deed, we bring the ledger from the store, we bring witnesses. If there is claim, it will be heard." The stranger considered this. "And if the claim requires inspection of the land itself?" "Then we inspect it together," the taller neighbor said. All eyes turned to her. She felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders, years of careful preparation. The underground shed, the hidden passage, the papers wrapped tight in oilcloth. If she agreed, everything beneath her cabin might be exposed to scrutiny. If she refused, suspicion would grow like mold in damp wood. "You want what is owed," she said to the stranger. "I do, and if nothing is owed?" "Then I will ride away." The promise sounded simple. Too simple. The first faint gray of dawn began to edge through the storm clouds, barely visible through the snow-covered glass. The night had stretched long, filled with questions that had no answer yet. She stepped toward the hearth and rested her hand once more against the floorboards. Beneath them lay not just storage and shelter, but her father's last safeguard, the proof of his honesty, or perhaps the proof of something far more complicated. When she lifted her head, Her decision was clear in her eyes, though no one could yet tell which way it leaned. "In the morning," she said, her voice calm but firm, "we will open what lies beneath." The stranger's gaze sharpened with anticipation. The neighbors stiffened with worry. Outside, the storm had nearly spent itself. The clearing lay buried under clean, untouched snow. And beneath that snow, beneath the cabin floor, beneath the frozen earth, waited the truth that would either break her claim to this land or bind the valley together stronger than before. No one in that small room spoke again as the first light of day crept in, thin and cold, carrying with it the promise of revelation. Morning came slow and pale, like it too was unsure of what it would reveal. The storm had passed, leaving the clearing buried under a clean stretch of snow that reached almost to the porch steps. The world looked softer than it had the night before, but the tension inside the cabin had not melted with the wind. She was the first to move. Without speaking, she added another log to the stove, more out of habit than need. The underground shed had done its job all winter, keeping the firewood dry and steady through storm after storm. The warmth in the cabin felt earned, not borrowed. The taller neighbor pushed the chair away from the door and opened it carefully. Snow had drifted high against the frame, but daylight pushed through bright and sharp. The air outside was still, almost too still, as if waiting. "We do this proper," he said quietly. She nodded. The stranger adjusted his coat and stepped onto the porch. His horse stamped in the snow, restless but unharmed. He looked across the clearing, studying the land in full light now. The cabin stood firm. The yard lay smooth except for faint shapes beneath the snow where the underground shed rested. They all walked toward it together. The snow had packed hard overnight. The quieter neighbor used the back of a shovel leaning against the cabin to scrape away the top layer. Soon the outline of the wooden hatch showed through. The same hatch the men had discovered days before. The same hatch that had started whispers in town. She stepped forward and brushed the remaining snow away with her gloves. Her movements were calm, steady. She lifted the heavy door. Cold morning air spilled down the stone steps, but the scent rising from below was dry and clean. Rows of oak and maple logs sat stacked exactly as before, neat, orderly, protected from damp and decay. The stranger leaned closer, scanning the cellar. "Firewood," he said, almost to himself. "You expected something else?" the taller neighbor asked. "I expected a hiding place," he replied. "It is a hiding place," she said. "For what matters in winter?" the stranger straightened. "And beneath the cabin?" The clearing went quiet again. She closed the hatch and faced him fully. "If you wish to see beneath the cabin, you will see it all. No tearing up boards, no secret digging. We do it my way." He hesitated only a moment. "Very well," they returned to the cabin. Inside, the morning light filtered through frosted windows, illuminating every corner of the small space. She moved to the wooden shelf and took down the box she had held the night before. The neighbors watched closely. The stranger's eyes never left her hands. She set the box on the table and opened it. Inside lay folded papers, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The material was worn at the edges, but sealed tight against moisture. "My father taught me that winter is not the only thing that can steal from you," she said softly. "Damp can ruin wood. Carelessness can ruin records." She unwrapped the first bundle and spread the papers on the table. There was the deed to the land bearing her father's name and the official stamp from the county office in the nearest town. There were tax receipts for timber sold and taxes paid. Dates lined up with seasons long past, names of buyers, amounts received. The stranger leaned in, reading closely. "These could be copies," he said after a moment. "They are originals," she replied. "Signed and witnessed. You may check the ink." The paper, the quieter neighbor pointed to a signature near the bottom of one page. "That is the old registrar's mark." "I remember it." The stranger's jaw tightened slightly. He flipped to the next paper. A ledger page, detailing a timber shipment sent downriver the year before her father passed. Payment recorded in full. A signature from the buyer confirming receipt. He read it twice. "You said there were disputes," she said. "There were, but they were settled. My father kept proof. And yet," the stranger said slowly, "there are men who believe they were wronged." She reached back into the box and withdrew another folded sheet. This one older, edges browned with time? This is a letter, she said, from one of those men. He admitted confusion in the boundary lines. He apologized for the claim once the survey was corrected. She placed it in front of him. He read in silence. The neighbors waited. Outside, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The stranger exhaled through his nose, long and measured. This letter was never recorded. It was sent to my father, she said. He kept it as he kept everything. The taller neighbor folded his arms. Seems to me you have what you came for, proof. The stranger's eyes flicked once more toward the floor. And beneath the boards? She met his gaze without blinking. You wish to see that too? He hesitated, then nodded. She walked to the hearth and knelt, running her fingers along the edge of two particular planks. With practiced motion, she lifted a narrow section of flooring. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity, no deeper than a foot. Inside rested a tin box, sealed and dry. She lifted it out and placed it on the table beside the other papers. This is what lies beneath my cabin, she said. She opened it. Inside were more records. A small cloth pouch containing a few silver coins and a map. The stranger leaned closer as she unfolded the map. It showed the land boundaries as surveyed after the dispute years ago, marked clearly, signed by both parties. There are no tunnels, she said evenly. No hidden shipments, only precaution. I built the underground shed because I learned from my father that what keeps you alive in winter should not be left exposed. The same goes for truth. The stranger studied the map, then the receipts again. The neighbors watched his face for any flicker of doubt. At last he straightened. It appears, he said carefully, that the claim I was sent to investigate is without standing. The tension that had filled the cabin for days seemed to loosen all at once. You rode through a storm for suspicion, the taller neighbor said. You found records? The stranger gave a small nod. I found preparation. Silence settled, but it felt different now, lighter. What will you tell the men who sent you? She asked. That the land is lawfully held. That the timber was paid for. That there is no debt to collect. The quieter neighbor let out a breath that turned almost into a laugh. All this over talk. Talk can travel far, the stranger replied. Especially where land and money are concerned. He began gathering his coat. I misjudged you, he said to her, not unkindly. I saw a lone cabin and assumed weakness. You were not the only one, she replied. The neighbor shifted slightly, embarrassed. He paused at the door. The underground shed is a clever design. Dry firewood through winter is no small thing. It is survival, she said simply. He nodded once more and stepped out into the bright snow. They watched him untie his horse and ride slowly down the clearing toward the road. His figure grew smaller against the white fields until he disappeared beyond the trees. Inside the cabin, warmth seemed to expand into every corner. The taller neighbor turned to her. You should have shown us those papers sooner. I did not know I needed to, she said. The quieter one gave a sheepish smile. We saw no smoke and thought you were struggling. You found my underground shed and thought I was hiding something worse, she replied, though there was no sharpness in her tone. He rubbed the back of his neck. I suppose we did. She replaced the tin box beneath the floorboards and set the planks back into place. The wooden box of records returned to its shelf. I built a shed to keep my firewood dry all winter, she said. But I kept my father's records dry for another reason. Winter passes. Rumors sometimes do not, the taller neighbor chuckled softly. Town will have plenty to say now. Let them, she answered. Later that afternoon, the three of them walked back to town together. The clearing behind them looked peaceful again. Snow sparkled under the sun. The chimney of her cabin released a thin ribbon of smoke, steady and visible now in the cold air. At the general store, the story unfolded in full. The deed, the receipts, the letter of apology. The underground shed that had started it all. By evening, the tone of talk had changed. Where there had been suspicion, there was now respect. People spoke of her planning, her strength, her father's careful ways. Some even asked how to build a stone-lined cellar to keep their own firewood dry through winter storms. Over the next weeks, neighbors came by not out of doubt but out of curiosity. She showed them the underground shed openly, explained how the stone walls kept moisture out, How storing logs below ground protected them from heavy snow and wind. It became less of a secret and more of a lesson. The valley shifted in small but meaningful ways. Woodpiles were covered better. A few families began digging shallow cellars of their own. They spoke more openly about old disputes and cleared them up before they could harden into something worse. As for her, she continued much as before. She rose early, split wood when needed, tended her shelves of preserved food. But there was a difference in how people greeted her in town. They no longer saw only a woman alone in an old cabin. They saw someone who had prepared, who had stood firm, who had faced a storm both outside and within her walls. One evening near the end of winter, she stood in her yard as the sun dipped low over the hills. The snow had begun to soften at the edges. A hint of thaw lingered in the air. She looked at the place where the underground shed lay hidden beneath the white. It had kept her logs dry all winter. It had kept her warm when others doubted. And in the end it had drawn out the truth that settled old rumors once and for all. Winter would come again, as it always did. Storms would rise. Questions might too. But she knew now that the strength of a home is not only in its walls or its woodpile, it is in preparation, in honesty kept safe, in neighbors willing to stand beside you when the wind howls loudest. She turned back toward the cabin, smoke rising steady from the chimney, and stepped inside to tend the fire that had never once gone out.